This is the story of Karl Marx. So, what he basically thought was that, behind every kind of these work, there is a labor involved. Like all the commodities, and he basically has also was so much um, opposition to the ideas of the capitalism, where they have uh, brought they have mixed up the things, they have changed the use value into the exchange value, and the things basically are getting worse a lot for the people. That's basically something uh, like, say for example, what happened in the mid late 19th century. The Great Britain, there was unrest. So, and and protests due to Chartism. Chartism was a working class movement, which emerged in 1836 and was most active between 1838 and 1848. The aim of Chartists was to gain political rights and influence for the working classes. That was when Lewis model and other kind of the growth models came into play. What they suggested, that the people should move from the agriculture sector to industrial sector, because in the agriculture sector there are so many people who are extra, who are working there and who are basically living there. Their marginal product is either zero or negative. So what you can do is you can move them from the agricultural rural sectors to the industrial urban sectors. But what happened with them, they were free people. They were they used to work in their own farmlands, but when they went to the industries, they basically were treated very, very badly, because the objective of the business is to make profits, and to gain those profits, basically they can do anything, they reduce the cost, and that what basically they had to work very, very long hours, and they were being paid very, very low, as the video also pointed out. And there was also periodic unemployment. There was no kind of welfare state available, no universal right to vote. They were basically being treated as slaves. So at that point of time, this Marxist idea, basically, and mid 19th, century Europe, basically, there was a revolution in France, and there was times of turmoil and anarchy in the France as well. So how Marx understood this? Marx basically, it was all because of money. And, there are two classes exist. One is called the bourgeoisie. This is a capitalist class. You work for the capitalist, and the person basically owns capital. The person who owns resources, he is the master of yours. So it is like a modern day slavery, where you basically you are working for a capitalist. You are say for example, look at the share that you get out of the total profits. Look at the share, say for example, the people get, say for example, if you look at the total revenue of the companies and look at the contribution of the people into that particular organization, that is quite small. So that basically led so much unrest among all people, and that was something. The other that does not have, it's called the workers, the proletariat, and they were basically suppressed people. So there's a conflict of classes. There are two kinds of classes exist. So the interests of the bourgeoisie and proletariat do not coincide. That was a conflict theory, as the video suggests as well. And that was something, the rich is getting richer and the poor is getting poorer. So most of this time, this fortune comes on the shoulders of the working class, whose interest this capital class never serve. So working class will stand against the capitalist class revolution. And this revolution is could change their fate, and a new communist society will come into existence. So this is that is what something basically he gave the birth to communism. Resources should be held by the community. Resources should be held by everyone. Say for example, when Zulfikar Ali Bhutto took over in 1970s, in early 70s in Pakistan. Before that, there was a time of Ayub Khan. Ayub Khan was more liberal. He was very liberal. All the dictators basically we have had in in Pakistan, they were economically very liberal. They had a very liberal mindset. Say for example, be it is Musharraf, Ziaul Haq, or Ayub Khan, they were all basically very actually had a liberal mind. But when he came, he gave the slogan of roti kapra and makan to people, and that basically changed, and he basically became popular, and that was the kind of a movement. And what he did basically, he took away all the factories and things basically from the people and nationalized them. So before Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, that was owned by people, but afterwards that was owned by the state. So things basically yeah. Sorry. uh, to a large extent, like they do basically, because they have a controlled kind of economic system. They basically, like, for a very long period of time, like, say, for example, if you recall the period or the turmoil basically China has gone through, they have got a very active state role. Like, they have been very much like, that was, there are so many things basically owned by, combinedly with the like, of the state. Like, they were actually like combinedly with the people. All right. So we ended, like on the depression. What depression did, it gave birth to macroeconomics. And, the macroeconomics is more about what? Like, it's about the aggregate behaviors. But the modern macroeconomics that initially were introduced was the short-term macroeconomics, and that was more relative to stability. The world got so cautious about this whole crisis. The world did not want to go back into this kind of trouble. And what they did, they started taking a lot care in their actions. And, and that basically, like, you can have a, like, either of two things. Either you, like, have stability in your country, or you have a growth. If you want to grow, if you really want to have growth in your country, what you have to do, you have to compromise on your stability. Like, say, for example, if you want to drive your car fast, you have to, like, compromise your stability. You can't be, like, both fast as well as stable. Like, to some extent you can, but, like, to a very large extent you cannot. You have to have, like, a kind of objective, that what is your objective? You want stability or you want growth? So what happened, like, for a very long period of time between 1930 and 1970s, almost 40 years, the world witnessed a kind of a lull period. Lull in the sense that they were basically, like, having policies which were more triggered towards stability. They were not looking towards growth. And that basically, like, made people bored with these all policies. Like, as we have learned this particular kind of things in microeconomics as well, like, in 1970s, people get bored with Keynesian kind of policies. They thought, like, that, like, for how long you will go for stability? If you don't grow, things will, like, end. Because, and that there was also a pressure, because the population was increasing. The world's population was around 2 billion in 1950, and we reached to 6 billion mark in 2000. You must remember that, like, the world celebrated the first birth, like the birth of like 6 billion baby in China, in India, in 2000. So during this 50 years, we added 4 billion people to the world's population. The world could not afford to go, like, cautiously. It had to just, like, experiment with its kind of things. So a resurgence of classical liberalism actually, like, happened. And, like, this is something is about this particular kind of episode. Yeah. So population generally, grows geometrically, and that was basically predicted by so many people like Malthus and other people, like that. Uh, Population was initially very low. Like, say, for example, the first billion we reached to around in the early 19th century, and the second billion reached around to, like, around in 1950. And, like, and that is what happens, like, because, and there is also a demographic transition. What was happening initially, that there was very high birth rate and high death rate. But as vaccinations, like, were invented, hospitalization improved. Like, people started taking good care of their, like, women and children, and they actually established hospitals. They established kind of vaccinations. Like, say, for example, if you look at the, like, the time when basically these all, like, these all basic vaccinations were developing. After this development of this vaccination, what happened? Death rate fell, but birth rate didn't fall, because people actually were having a different kinds of, like, traditions. They used to have large families, and the idea of having large family was to have, like, a large family, so that if they lose some member, like, they still, like, have got some kind of helping hand. So if you talk to your grandparents or great grandparents, if you have any alive, like in your family, they would tell you that how large families they used to have. But now things basically are getting like, people are going back towards the sustainable population growth. There are so many countries in which the population growth has become zero. Zero means like death rate and birth rate both are equal. Maybe some of them, like of course, like just went into the negative side as well, because if their death rate actually is less than is like is less than their birth rate, so like their death rate is more than their birth rate, so then basically of course you actually have a negative kind of a population growth. Yeah. Hmm. What I was actually thinking, what a good effect of this diet. Like in the previous days, this diet was longer than this every day. Yeah. Means that the number of people dying is better than the number of people dying now. No, like like say for example, this vaccination. After like this corona vaccination, things will get better. Like people won't die as much as they were dying before. And like what actually is happening, we are also controlling the death rate. The death rate and the birth rate both are being controlled. Like it's not the one side of the story altogether. Like we are also controlling the death rate. Like say for example, if you look at some villages in Britain, you will like see like their average life actually is life expectancy in those villages is more than 100 years. Yeah, maybe like some of the areas, like it's not the overall the country, like in some of the areas or some of the regions basically have got very high life expectancy. And why they have been able to do that, like they have got like being Muslim, we have a belief that like you have a certain number of years basically, or certain number of months or days or minutes or seconds and nanoseconds, and like if you go like even smaller than that, like you have got counted that. But somehow like they have made them healthy, like they have just giving them due care, like if you look at the way basically they have taken care of their old people. And and that's something is very different. So it is so they are not letting their old people die, and they are not letting the young people to reproduce children. So it's, yeah, and they are offering, and they are basically having a problem of aged population. Like say for example, China is struggling. China is losing to India basically just because of the like this kind of aged population. They don't have got young people, like and they have got like if you look at the population of China demographically, they have become so unstable. They have got more men than women, because of the one child policy. They used to abort their fetus when they found out that it is a like female fetus. So it was a huge like thing basically that happened. Like आप एक वो एक डॉक्यूमेंट्री है चाइना के बच्चों के बारे में, क्या नाम है इसका, इतनी डिप्रेसिंग किस्म की, वो वहां पे बच्चों को मरने के लिए छोड़ देते हैं. मतलब आप, मुझे उसका डॉक्यूमेंट्री का नाम याद नहीं आ रहा, इट्स अ वेरी फेमस डॉक्यूमेंट्री. तो आई डोंट रिमेंबर द नेम. तो उसमें वो बच्चों को मरने के लिए छोड़ देते हैं. लाइक यू फाइंड पीपल एक्चुअली लाइक आर लेफ्ट फॉर डाइंग बेसिकली. इनके पास एक से ज्यादा बच्चे और ज्यादा बच्चियां होती थी वहां. तो वहां पे डेमोग्राफिकली दे हैव लाइक दे हैव जस्ट डिस्ट्रॉयड देयर डेमोग्राफिक स्ट्रक्चर एज वेल. लाइक द मोर चाइनीज बेसिकली मैरिंग पीपल लाइक आउटसाइड चाइना. अभी कुछ से पहले स्कैंडल भी आया था यहाँ पर, वो चाइनीज में वो शादियां कर करके लेके जा रहे हैं. जैसे वो लोग जो है चाइना शादी कर करके लेके जा रहे थे, दे वर फ्रॉड्स बेसिकली देयर. ये काफी ज्यादा जो है वो इनका. So neoliberalism emerged at the end of the 1970s, once again emphasis like on growth rather than stability as a main goal of government policy. So it was a time when people get bored with it. Like they were basically like the world was moving. Like if you just are driving a car like at a speed of 40 or 30 kilometers per hour, like you are stable, but you get bored at certain point of time and you just put accelerator and you just wanted to go, like without thinking that what actually is going to happen next. So it's kind of a thing basically, people got bored with it, and things basically this is resurgence happened of this economic neoliberalism. And this neoliberalism popularly labeled as conservatism, because the two parties heads that basically were like on the back of this movement were from the conservative parties, like say for example Margaret Thatcher from UK and Ronald Reagan from the US. So that is why this was called conservatism as well. So that is what basically they are all conservative. Basically, is something is that basically is also called. So once again, emphasize the virtues of atomistic, like individuals, and the virtues of free market capitalism. and while also stressing the evils of so-called big government, including government regulation and welfare programs. So there's a huge, a document which is about the social insurance programs, which were stopped, during this particular period, and the government's role basically became so less. So what happened during 1970s? Uh, you must remember that following this 1945, at the end of the Second World War, there was a fixed exchange rate system. A fixed exchange rate system. Every country had a fixed exchange rate system against the dollar. So when they had to keep that exchange rate fixed, like say for example, when they were losing value against the dollar, they had to do the something, like say for example, if Pakistani rupee loses value against the dollar, if the dollar is getting if the dollar's demand is high and rupee's demand is low, so you basically increase the demand of rupee. The government does it. And if the demand for dollar is low, you just make the demand of dollar. So you basically always try to keep the things at some at certain fixed rate. But that was replaced by flexible or floating exchange rate in 1973. So that gave more power to market. Like say for example, recently what has happened, that Pakistan's government has also, because of the pressure of IMF, has introduced this floating exchange rate system. We had got a floating exchange rate system, but we had got managed floating exchange rates. We were allowing our exchange rate to fluctuate, but when actually this exchange rate used to go beyond certain limit, we actually were we intervene into this. And but now basically we have a fully a floating exchange rate, although recently the government intervened into it because the dollar was actually losing so much value against rupee. At one point of time, that became like an interbank rate of the dollar was 149 rupees. But they somehow intervened into this and they just increased it to around 152, 151. So it is something happening right now. So but still that the world basically went to the market determination system. When this is called market based system. Market based system means this depends on demand and supply. It does not depend on your desires, that what kind of exchange rate you want to have. You want to increase it, you want to decrease it. Let's leave it on the market forces. If the demand is higher than supply, the value of your currency will go again, increase against the other currency, otherwise it will fall. So that same year OPEC was formed, because of there was things happened because oil prices increased, quadrupled, and things basically changed a lot. Keynes' policy to deal with recession generated stagflation. The stagflation. Stagflation is a existence of low growth and inflation. Sorry? No, yeah, stagnant and inflation are both, because stagnation in the sense because your growth rate is low, inflation is for inflation. What happened? What happens, for a very long period of time, the people were using Phillips curve. Do you know Phillips curve? The Phillips curve explains the relationship between inflation and unemployment, or in other words, growth. So if you want to grow, or if you want to reduce unemployment, you can do it at the cost of increasing inflation. But what happened during this particular period? Inflation rose, but output didn't grow. Economies did not grow because reasons were cost push or some other kind of factors. So the economy did not grow, and that was the time when these Keynesian policies failed. The Keynes said, you can control growth rate by changing the money supply. You can increase inflation. If you are able to, or you are willing to bear with higher inflation, you can have higher growth. So to have high growth, you will have to bear with high inflation. And this high inflation can be done by taking some monetary policy actions from the central bank. But what happened during 1970s, that this policy failed. And this policy failed very miserably because the world faced a problem of stagflation, and the world basically was having inflation but without having growth. All right, so it was a kind of a situation that basically happened, and that's why people actually started thinking something beyond the Keynesian view of the economics. So the meaning of classical liberalism. The term classical liberalism was applied to, in retrospect, to distinguish earlier 19th century liberalism from the newer social liberalism. It is also mean again the liberty under the law is also sometimes used to refer all form of liberalism before and this is, and what caused stagflation in 1970s? That was the belief that the Phillips curve could solve the problem, but later on, due to the increase in prices, things basically, inflation increased, but output didn't grow. All right, I just take a moment here, and I want to discuss with you about the